They called her the ugliest woman in London. For 7 long years, Eleanor Ashford allowed the world to believe it, not because she agreed with them, but because hiding was easier than hoping. Pity cut deeper than cruelty. She had learned early that when society decided your worth, fighting it only drained the strength from your heart. So she stepped quietly out of the world and told herself it was her own decision. Everything had changed when Eleanor was 15 years old. That year was meant to be her season. Her father, the Earl of Ashford, had promised that London would finally know her name. She practiced her curtsy every morning until her knees ached. She memorized the steps of every dance. She dreamed of warm, candlelit ballrooms, filled with music and laughter, most of all. Yet she imagined the moment when a gentleman might look across a crowded room, meet her eyes, and choose her. 3 days before her debut, the carriage accident happened. Eleanor remembered very little of it. The crash, the breaking glass, the frightened voices. All those sounds disappeared from her mind like smoke. What remained clear was the moment she woke in her bedroom with heavy bandages wrapped around her face. Her mother sat beside the bed, crying quietly into a handkerchief. The surgeon spoke softly to her father in the corner of the room. Eleanor heard only parts of his words. She is fortunate to be alive. The glass missed her eye. She will heal. What he did not say was even clearer. The scar would never disappear. It ran from the corner of Eleanor's left eye down along her cheek to the edge of her jaw. Pale, sharp, and impossible to hide completely. In those early weeks, Eleanor refused to look in a mirror. Her mother covered every mirror in the house with dark cloth, as if the home was mourning a death. Perhaps it was. The girl who once dreamed about love and admiration had vanished that night on the road. London judged quickly. The whispers began before Eleanor even left her room. Servants heard the gossip in kitchens and corridors, and carried it home with them. Such a tragedy. She might have been beautiful. Now she will never marry. Poor girl. Within weeks, Eleanor Ashford was no longer spoken of as a young lady preparing for society. She had become a warning story, whispered between mothers and daughters. At 18, her father convinced her to attend one last ball. He believed that if people saw her again, that if they watched her smile and speak with kindness, they might remember that beauty did not live only in a face. Eleanor agreed only because she loved him. That night, she wore a gown of deep green silk. Her hair was arranged carefully to fall across the left side of her face, hiding as much of the scar as possible. For a short time, it seemed her father might be right. Then, near midnight, she heard a young lord laughing loudly behind her. His voice was careless and cruel. "Look there," he said to his friends. "London's ugliest." The words settled into Eleanor's heart like cold stone. She did not cry. She did not cause a scene. She finished the glass of champagne in her hand, walked calmly to her father, and asked him to take her home. The next morning she made a quiet decision. She would never attend another ball. What if London wanted her invisible? She would disappear completely. Eleanor left the city and returned to Ashford Park, the quiet countryside estate where she had spent her childhood. There she found comfort in the one place that had always felt safe to her: the stables. Horses did not stare at scars. They did not whisper behind polite smiles. They did not care about beauty or reputation. Among them, Eleanor felt whole again. She learned everything about them: their tempers, their bloodlines, their habits. She spent hours brushing their coats and walking the fields with them. Slowly, the broken pieces of her confidence began to rebuild. One stormy night, a black foal was born in thunder and rain. The young horse stood within minutes, strong and restless, his dark coat shining like midnight. Her father named him Midnight Storm, but he said the horse would change everything. Eleanor did not believe in signs anymore, but she loved the foal fiercely from the moment he opened his curious eyes. Midnight Storm grew quickly. By the time he was 3 years old, he had become the fastest horse in England. Wealthy men offered fortunes for him. Letters arrived from across the country promising enormous sums of money. The Earl of Ashford refused every offer. Midnight Storm was family. Then, one winter afternoon, the Duke of Ravensmore arrived. Alexander Blackwood was known everywhere in England. He was tall and striking with dark hair and sharp gray eyes that reminded people of winter skies. He carried himself with quiet confidence that made others step aside without being asked. But his reputation was not only admiration. Rumors followed him like shadows. Gambling, debts, dangerous wagers whispered behind gloved hands in London drawing rooms. He came once to see the horse, then again and again. Each time he offered more money. Each time, Eleanor's father refused. On his 4th visit, something changed. Eleanor did not hear it directly from her father. Instead, she learned about it through a letter delivered to her room one quiet morning. The Duke of Ravensmore wished to marry her. In exchange, Midnight Storm would become part of her dowry. There had been no proposal, no romantic speech, no promise of affection, only a bargain. Eleanor read the letter twice before placing it gently on the table. She expected anger to rise inside her. Instead, she felt strangely calm. She was 22 years old, long past the hopeful dreams of girlhood. Perhaps this marriage would give her life a purpose again. If the Duke wanted the horse badly enough to marry her, then she would accept the arrangement. The wedding took place on a cold December morning inside the small chapel at Ashford Park. Snow covered the ground outside the windows. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress and a thick veil that made the world around her appear soft and distant. She walked down the aisle alone. The Duke stood waiting near the altar, tall and still, like a statue carved from stone. For a long moment he did not look at her. Only when she reached his side did his eyes lift. They were calm, distant, and measuring. Not warm, not curious, only calculating. They spoke their vows. When the ceremony ended, he did not kiss her. The carriage ride to Ravensmore Hall passed in silence. Eleanor watched the frost-covered fields through the window, while the Duke stared in the opposite direction. She wondered if he was thinking about the horse. Ravensmore Hall rose slowly out of the winter mist. It looked enormous and quiet, its tall stone walls dark against the pale sky. Servants waited at the entrance, standing in a long line. Their faces were polite and expressionless, but Eleanor felt their curiosity like a cold wind. Inside, the halls felt grand and empty. Her chambers were beautiful, but strangely cold. Blue and silver fabrics covered the walls. The bed was enormous, large enough to lose herself in. A room fit for a duchess. A room with no warmth. That night, Eleanor sat alone before the large mirror in her chamber. Slowly, she lifted her veil. The scar stared back at her. But beneath it, she saw her mother's gentle eyes. She saw the stubborn strength of her father's jaw. She saw survival. Footsteps approached outside her door. A firm knock followed. Once, then again. The Duke had come. Eleanor stood slowly. Her heart pounded hard in her chest, but her hands did not tremble. She crossed the room and turned the key in the lock. The small click echoed through the chamber. Outside the door, the Duke paused. His voice came through the wood, calm but surprised. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "You married me for a horse, Your Grace," she said clearly. "You shall have him." Her fingers rested against the cool brass lock. "But you will not have me. Not tonight. Not until you earn the right to stand before me as more than a man collecting a purchase." Silence followed, long and heavy. Then, from the other side of the door, the Duke laughed quietly. not with cruelty, not with anger, with interest. And in that moment, Eleanor realized she had done something dangerous. She had made the Duke of Ravensmore curious. The days after the wedding night passed in a strange and careful silence. Eleanor waited for anger. She expected commands, cold authority, perhaps even force. The law favored husbands, and a locked door meant little if a man wished to remind his wife of her place. She prepared herself for that moment, but it never came. Alexander Blackwood did not mention the locked door. He did not scold her or demand obedience. Instead, he simply watched. At breakfast, he sat at the far end of the long dining table. His gray eyes followed her quietly over the rim of his teacup. When she crossed the halls, she often felt his gaze resting on her back. It was not desire. It was not cruelty. It was curiosity, as if she were a puzzle that no longer matched the story he had once believed. The household at Ravensmore Hall was uneasy. Servants whispered in corners. A duchess who locked her husband out on the wedding night was a scandal waiting to bloom. No one dared say it openly, but Eleanor could sense their questions. Mrs. Blackwood, the stern housekeeper, treated Eleanor with cold politeness that felt sharper than open rudeness. Only one person in the house behaved as if nothing strange had happened. She was 8 years old and named Lily. Eleanor first saw her in the quiet library a few days after the wedding. The child sat curled in a window seat with a book so large it nearly hid her small face. But when Eleanor stepped inside, she expected the girl to jump up and run away. Instead, Lily looked up calmly. "I like stories about brave women," she announced. Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Why?" she asked gently. "Because they survive terrible things," Lily said simply. The girl's eyes rested on Eleanor's face without hesitation. Not once did they move to the scar. It unsettled Eleanor more than pity ever had. Soon, Lily began following Eleanor everywhere, through the gardens, through the long halls, even down to the stables. She asked questions adults were too careful to ask. Why do grown people pretend so much? Why do big houses feel lonely? Why do horses listen better than people? Eleanor did not always know how to answer, but she listened, and slowly their quiet friendship grew. On the 5th morning after the wedding, Eleanor walked to the stables. Midnight Storm had arrived from Ashford Park the day after her marriage. From her bedroom window, she had watched the stable hands struggle to guide him from the carriage. Even from far away, she could see the restless power in his body. When Eleanor stepped into the stall, the horse lifted his head immediately. For one still moment, he stared. Then he stepped forward and pressed his nose gently against her shoulder. A soft breath escaped his lungs. Recognition. Comfort. Eleanor closed her eyes as tears filled them. That was how Alexander found her. He stood quietly in the doorway of the stable, watching the scene in silence. Horse and woman stood together as if they had always belonged side by side. "He comes to you," Alexander said quietly. Eleanor turned. "So he will not allow anyone else near him," the Duke continued. "I raised him," Eleanor replied softly. "To him, I am safe." Alexander stepped closer, studying the powerful animal with fascination. "Show me," he said. "Show you what?" "How you earn his trust." Eleanor hesitated. Power had been rare in her life for many years, yet she slowly nodded. "Move slowly," she said. "Do not stare directly at him." Alexander followed her instructions carefully. "Let him hear your breathing. Let him feel that you are calm." When Eleanor gently guided the Duke's hand toward the horse's neck, she felt a slight tremor in his arm. Fear. Carefully hidden, but real. Midnight Storm sniffed Alexander's sleeve before allowing the touch. The great horse remained calm. "Trust is not taken," Eleanor said quietly. It is given." Alexander turned his head toward her then. For the first time since their wedding, he truly looked at her. Not at the scar, not past it, at her. "Is that what you are waiting for?" he asked softly. "For me to earn yours?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I am waiting for you to see me." Something changed in his eyes. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand toward her face. He hesitated before touching her. Then his fingers rested gently against the smooth curve of her unscarred cheek. The touch was so light, it stole her breath. "I see you," he said quietly, "and what I see is fire." Without another word, Alexander stepped back and left the stable. That night, Eleanor did not lock her door. She waited in her chamber beside the dying fire, wrapped in her mother's shawl. Yet her heart beat with quiet fear and fragile hope. Midnight passed. The Duke did not come. In the morning, she found a single white rose placed outside her door. Beside it lay a small, folded note. "I am not yet worthy, but I am trying." Something inside Eleanor softened. Days slowly grew easier after that. Alexander began seeking her company. Sometimes they met in the library. Sometimes they walked together through the gardens. Often they returned to the stables where Midnight Storm stood proudly like a silent witness. They spoke about many things. Alexander told her about his childhood, about a father who gambled away everything he owned, about a mother who died quietly from shame and exhaustion. Eleanor spoke about the accident, about the years she had spent hiding from the world. They did not touch again, or they did not speak about love. But something fragile and new began to grow between them. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived from Ashford Park. It carried her father's seal. Eleanor read it alone in her room. By the time she finished, the world beneath her feet felt suddenly unstable. Her father explained the truth that Eleanor had never known. Alexander's interest in Midnight Storm had never been only about money. He had made a wager with Lord Hartington. The winner would gain everything. When Alexander realized he could not win without the fastest horse in England, he agreed to marry Eleanor because she was the price. Her marriage had been part of a gamble. Eleanor burned the letter in the fireplace with shaking hands. When that evening she dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk and walked into the dining hall with her scar fully uncovered. Alexander stood as she entered. His eyes softened immediately. "You look beautiful tonight," he said. The word cut through her like a blade. She sat across from him at the long table. Then she told him everything. The wager, the horse, the truth her father had revealed. Alexander did not lie. He did not deny a single word. "I married you because I needed the horse," he admitted quietly. Silence filled the room. Then he spoke again. "But I stayed because I came to know you." Eleanor listened with a heart that felt both broken and strangely stronger. "I will not forgive you easily," she said calmly. "And I will not be managed like a prize." Alexander nodded slowly. I would not ask you to." "If you want the horse," she continued, "and if you want me, you must earn both." For the first time since she had known him, Alexander looked uncertain. That night he told her everything. About the debts, about his hatred of becoming the same kind of man his father had been, about the rival who had destroyed his family's reputation. For the first time, Eleanor saw not a duke, not a gambler, not a calculating man. She saw someone wounded, someone trapped by the past. And somewhere deep inside her heart, something fragile began to change. But neither of them knew yet that the hardest test was still waiting ahead. The night before the Epsom Derby arrived quietly, yet Eleanor felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. She could not sleep. Long after the candles in Ravensmore Hall had burned low and the servants had retired, Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked through the silent corridors. The cold marble floors echoed softly beneath her steps. Her path led her to the stables. Midnight Storm stood inside his stall, strong and restless, even in the quiet darkness. The lantern light brushed against his black coat, making it shine like polished stone. When Eleanor stepped close, the horse lowered his head toward her. She rested her hand against his neck. "You must win tomorrow," she whispered softly. "Not for pride, not for money, for hope." The horse breathed steadily, calm beneath her touch. Footsteps approached behind her. Eleanor did not turn. Somehow she already knew who it was. Alexander stopped beside the stall door, but for a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke without the usual confidence that wrapped around him like armor. "I have spent most of my life believing that winning was the only way to survive," he said quietly. Eleanor turned slowly to face him. "But now?" she asked. Alexander looked at her with a truth she had never seen in his eyes before. "Now, I only want to deserve you." His words were simple. No grand speech, no attempt to persuade her, just truth. "I love you," he said. The confession did not sound like a demand. It sounded like a surrender. "I love you whether you ever return it or not." He turned slightly, as if preparing to leave her alone with the horse. Eleanor reached out and caught his sleeve before he could step away. Her heart pounded hard against her ribs. "I cannot promise love yet," she said softly. But I promise honesty." Alexander's eyes searched her face carefully. Then Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss was gentle and cautious, like two wounded souls learning how to trust. For the first time since their strange marriage began, hope felt real. The morning of the race dawned bright and clear. Crowds gathered at Epsom Downs, filling the air with excitement and restless energy. Elegant carriages lined the hills, while wealthy spectators watched from grand stands. Midnight Storm stood among the other racing horses, powerful and calm. When the race began, he ran like a force of nature. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. For one breathless moment, the horses ran side by side across the green field. Then Midnight Storm surged forward. He crossed the finish line first. Cheers exploded across the racecourse. Alexander lifted Eleanor into his arms before the cheering crowd could even settle. For the first time since her accident years ago, Eleanor felt the gaze of hundreds of people and did not wish to disappear. She stood beside her husband proudly. Yet as the celebration continued, Eleanor noticed one face watching them from the edge of the crowd. Lord Hardington. His expression was calm, cold, and calculating. It was not the look of a defeated man. It was the look of someone already planning revenge. Victory followed them back to Ravensmore Hall, like warm sunlight after a long winter storm. Servants laughed more freely. The halls felt brighter. Alexander moved through the house with a lightness Eleanor had never seen before. But the uneasy feeling inside her remained. It returned weeks later when an invitation arrived. Where Lord Hardington was hosting a grand ball in London, Alexander immediately recognized the danger. "It is a trap," he said. Eleanor studied the gilded invitation carefully. "Yes," she agreed calmly, but refusing would show fear. So they went. Hardington House glittered with chandeliers and music. Wealthy guests filled every room, eager for gossip and spectacle. The moment Eleanor entered, eyes turned toward her, some curious, some cruel, some openly amused. The scar on her face was no longer hidden. But Eleanor walked forward with quiet confidence, her hand resting calmly on Alexander's arm. She danced. She smiled. She endured the whispers. Near midnight, Eleanor excused herself from the ballroom. The crowded air had grown heavy, and she needed a moment alone. The corridors beyond the ballroom were dim and quiet, and she turned a corner and suddenly heard voices. One of them was unmistakable. Lord Hardington. Eleanor froze. "The forgery is flawless," Hardington said smoothly. Another man laughed softly. "And when will you present it?" "Soon," Hardington replied. "By the time Blackwood discovers the truth, Ravensmore will already belong to me." Eleanor's heart pounded violently. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. Hardington continued speaking calmly about false documents, invented debts, and plans to destroy Alexander's estate through scandal and legal traps. The plan was precise, cruel, complete. Before fear could stop her, Eleanor stepped into the room. The men turned sharply. Hardington's polite smile appeared instantly, though surprise flickered in his eyes. "Duchess," he said coolly, "you should not be here. Neither should criminals planning forgery," Eleanor replied. The men laughed at first, then they saw her expression. Eleanor raised her voice clearly. "You are planning to destroy Ravensmore with false documents and lies," she said. Hardington's smile hardened. "And who will believe you?" A new voice answered from the doorway. "I will." Alexander stood there, his tall figure framed by the open door. Behind him stood several guests who had followed the raised voices from the hallway. "Ladies, gentlemen, witnesses." Hardington's confidence vanished. Within minutes, the truth began to collapse around him. Under pressure, lies unraveled quickly. The scandal spread across London within days. Hardington's reputation shattered. Creditors arrived. Friends vanished. Before the month ended, and he fled England in disgrace, Ravensmore was safe. But something else had changed as well. Society began speaking about Eleanor differently. She was no longer only the scarred duchess. She was the woman who had stood firm when danger threatened her husband and his house. Most importantly, Eleanor saw herself differently. Months passed peacefully. Seasons turned. Eleanor found happiness in quiet moments. Morning rides through the fields, evenings beside the fire. Lily curled beside her reading stories with fierce concentration. Alexander laughed more easily now. The darkness that once surrounded him had softened. One crisp autumn morning, Eleanor woke with a quiet certainty. She was carrying a child. Alexander's joy was deep and overwhelming. He held her carefully, as if she were something fragile and precious. Yet for the first time in many years, Eleanor imagined a future without fear. Their daughter was born on a bright autumn morning. Golden leaves covered the ground outside the windows of Ravensmore Hall. She was small and perfect, with dark hair and bright eyes. They named her Rose. As Eleanor held the child in her arms, tears filled her eyes. Not from pain, from gratitude. She thought about the frightened girl she had once been at 15, lying in bed behind bandages and believing her life had ended. She wished she could whisper through time to that girl, "Your life has only begun." Alexander leaned close and gently kissed the scar on Eleanor's cheek. "You are beautiful," he whispered. Eleanor smiled softly. "I am loved," she replied, "and that is more than enough." In the years that followed, Ravensmore Hall flourished. Midnight Storm's bloodline became famous across England. Lily grew into a clever young woman, full of curiosity and courage, and Eleanor walked through London without lowering her eyes. They no longer called her London's ugliest woman. They called her strong. One day, little Rose asked about the scar on her mother's face. Eleanor lifted her daughter into her arms and told her the truth. once the world had tried to break her, and it failed.